Powerful empaths have no friends. The hidden strength of emotional depth. Have you ever sat in a room full of laughing, chatting people, perhaps close friends or colleagues, and felt a profound, aching sense of complete isolation? Sighs. You are participating in the conversation, saying all the right things, yet underneath the surface, a quiet voice whispers, I am fundamentally alone here. Whispers. If you have experienced this, your immediate reaction was likely self-criticism. You asked yourself, what is wrong with me? Why can't I just enjoy this? Why can't I seem to hold on to large groups of friends like everyone else? Pause. We live in a culture that measures social success by volume. How many contacts are in your phone? How full your weekends are? How easily you glide through small talk at dinner parties? When someone consistently steps back from that noise, we label them disconnected, awkward, or distant. But psychological research into emotional intelligence reveals a far more fascinating reality. What if your small social circle or your complete lack of a traditional friend group isn't a sign of social failure at all? What if it is actually the direct mathematical result of advanced emotional depth? The truth is, powerful empaths rarely have a wide circle of friends. But the reason why is not what you think. It isn't because they lack social skills or dislike humanity. In fact, it is the exact opposite. They process emotional data at a frequency so high that ordinary social interactions become impossible to maintain without immense internal friction. If you stick with me through this entire discussion, you will understand the precise neurological and psychological mechanisms behind why emotional depth creates social solitude. More importantly, you will learn why this apparent isolation is actually your greatest hidden strength and how to stop treating your emotional depth as a social liability. High-level emotional depth creates an automatic filtering mechanism, naturally shrinking social circles to exclude superficial interactions. Powerful empaths don't just sense feelings, they absorb raw emotional data, making crowded, performing-based social dynamics mentally exhausting. Deep emotional clarity acts as a mirror to others, frequently triggering discomfort or defense mechanisms in those who avoid self-reflection. Loneliness is reframed not as a social deficiency, but as a biological and psychological necessity for nervous system regulation. True emotional intelligence shifts focus from collecting casual acquaintances to cultivating rare, high-resonance, authentic bonds. The architecture of emotional radar begins with understanding how the brain functions as an intricate processing engine for subtle social signals. Individuals possessing high emotional intelligence possess an acute biological and psychological sensory filter that operates continuously, even without their conscious permission. Every human interaction involves two distinct layers of communication: the verbal narrative that a person consciously chooses to present, and the subconscious physiological cues that reveal their authentic internal state. While the average observer focuses almost exclusively on the words being spoken, a highly emotionally perceptive individual is simultaneously scanning, decoding, and cataloging a complex matrix of micro-expressions, shifts in vocal cadence, variations in breathing patterns, and subtle changes in body language. When you enter a room, your neurological apparatus acts like a high-definition radar system sweeping through a low-frequency environment. Within a fraction of a second, before a single greeting is exchanged, your nervous system picks up on the ambient emotional baseline of the space. You notice the microscopic tightening around a colleague's eyes that signals concealed resentment, despite their warm smile. You register the slight tremor in a friend's voice that indicates suppressed panic, even as they speak with projected confidence. You pick up on the subtle lean of a body away from a conversation partner, betraying a deep-seated urge to disengage that neither party has explicitly acknowledged. This hyperattunement is driven by the rapid processing of mirror neurons, the specialized brain cells responsible for reflecting the actions and emotions of others within our own neural pathways. In individuals with advanced emotional depth, these systems are exceptionally active, creating a real-time simulation of another person's subjective experience inside the empath's own bodily state. The result is an extraordinary ability to read emotional incongruence. Incongruence occurs when there is a mismatch between what a person projects outwardly and what they are experiencing inwardly. For most people, this mismatch passes unnoticed. For the powerful empath, however, emotional incongruence creates a distinct psychological friction, much like hearing a musician play a single sharp note in an otherwise harmonious melody. This constant intake of raw emotional data carries a profound biological cost. Processing high-frequency social signals requires significant metabolic and mental bandwidth, while others are simply enjoying a casual conversation. The highly attuned individual is conducting a complex, subconscious diagnostic of the room's psychological climate. They are reading the hidden anxieties, unexpressed griefs, and veiled motives of everyone around them. This level of perceptual clarity renders surface-level social interactions deeply taxing rather than restorative. The architecture of this radar system is not a choice. It is an innate perceptual lens through which the world is experienced. It equips the individual with an unparalleled understanding of human nature, but it also fundamentally alters how they navigate relationships, making standard, superficial social dynamics feel remarkably hollow by comparison. The psychological dynamics surrounding high emotional intelligence is frequently misunderstood by mainstream social standards, particularly when it comes to the structure of personal relationships. A prevailing assumption in society is that having a small social circle or maintaining significant distance from large group dynamics is a reflection of poor social skills, awkwardness, or an inability to connect with others. However, when we analyze the behavior of highly emotionally developed individuals through the lens of emotional bandwidth and cognitive energy management, a completely different reality emerges. Powerful empaths do not lack the interpersonal mechanics required to charm a room, navigate complex social politics, or build extensive networks of acquaintances. In fact, their acute sensitivity often makes them exceptionally skilled at reading social dynamics and adapting to them smoothly. The decision to keep a small, quiet social footprint is not a result of capability failure, but a deliberate, strategic rejection of superficiality. Every human interaction requires a deposit of cognitive and emotional energy. When two individuals engage in a deep, authentic conversation where both parties are genuine, transparent, and self-aware, that interaction serves as a mutual exchange that replenishes energy. However, the vast majority of daily social interactions are built on superficial scripts, polite banter about the weather, performative small talk, superficial gossip, and ritualistic updates about daily routines that gloss over authentic human experiences. For an individual with low to moderate emotional depth, these interactions are harmless and easily managed, serving as low-cost social lubricant. But for an emotionally powerful individual whose baseline perception automatically picks up on the hidden motivations, unexpressed anxieties, and internal contradictions of the people around them, superficial interactions demand an immense expenditure of energy for virtually no return. Engaging in shallow social banter requires the empath to intentionally suppress their own depth, mask their natural baseline of perception, and participate in a social play that feels entirely hollow. This process leads to severe emotional exhaustion. The brain is continuously forced to process the contradiction between the performative layer of the conversation and the actual emotional reality underlying it, while simultaneously restricting itself from speaking to the truth of the situation. Over time, the cost-benefit analysis becomes undeniably clear. Participating in broad, superficial social networks drains vital psychological resources that are far better invested in self-mastery, focused creative endeavors, or a tiny handful of deeply aligned, authentic relationships. Choosing quality over quantity in social dynamics is fundamentally an act of energy conservation and self-preservation. Powerful empaths recognize that social connections should serve to illuminate and enrich human experience, not exhaust it through endless performative engagement. They understand that 10 superficial acquaintances cannot match the profound value of a single relationship grounded in total transparency and emotional alignment. By stripping away the bloat of unnecessary acquaintances, they protect their internal baseline, refusing to trade their peace of mind for the illusion of social popularity. The concept of the uncanny valley originates in robotics and artificial intelligence, describing the distinct sensation of unease that occurs when a human observes an entity that looks almost human but is subtly, unnervingly off. In the realm of advanced emotional intelligence and interpersonal psychology, a parallel phenomenon exists: the uncanny valley of inauthenticity. When an individual possesses an exceptionally acute emotional receiver, they do not merely listen to words. They continuously decode the alignment between an individual's internal emotional state and their external presentation. For the vast majority of society, small talk and social masks are accepted as necessary components of daily life, benign rituals that allow people to navigate public spheres without revealing their deepest vulnerabilities. However, to an emotionally powerful person, interacting with someone wearing a heavy social mask produces a jarring, visceral sensation of discomfort that makes forced interactions deeply exhausting. When an individual presents a curated, performative version of themselves, whether through exaggerated confidence, forced cheerfulness, or performative agreement, there is a measurable discrepancy between their verbal output and their physiological reality. A person might be speaking with enthusiasm about a recent event, yet their breathing remains shallow, their posture guarded, and their micro-expressions betray underlying stress or resentment. The average observer, operating on a standard perceptual baseline, simply accepts the external performance at face value. The highly perceptive empath, however, cannot turn off their internal radar. Their mirror neuron system and subconscious pattern recognition immediately register the incongruence between the broadcast and the internal reality. This discrepancy creates a form of psychological cognitive dissonance in the listener, making the interaction feel untruthful, strained, and fundamentally unsafe. This dynamic explains why forced small talk is not merely boring to a deeply intuitive person. It is physically and mentally taxing. To engage in superficial banter with someone who is actively hiding behind a social mask requires the empath to perform a double layer of labor. First, they must continuously process the truth of what the person is actually feeling, and second, they must suppress their own awareness in order to play along with the superficial script. To politely nod and agree with a statement that one knows is performative requires participating in a shared delusion. Over time, this constant navigation of hidden motives and performative behavior generates acute mental fatigue. The empath system instinctively revolts against the artificiality, craving raw, unvarnished human truth above all else. This intolerance for pretense is a primary reason why emotionally powerful individuals frequently step back from large social circles and corporate or social networking environments where masking is heavily normalized. They find no comfort in superficial praise, shallow networking, or superficial camaraderie, viewing these dynamics as transactional displays that erode genuine human connection. Rather than managing the subtle friction caused by unauthentic behavior, the empath chooses to retreat into environments where transparency is valued, They intuitively understand that an honest, difficult truth is infinitely preferable to a polite, comfortable falsehood, and they structure their personal boundaries to filter out those who are unwilling or unable to show up without their protective social armor. The psychological necessity of solitude for an emotionally perceptive individual is one of the most widely misunderstood aspects of human behavior. In a culture that prioritizes constant connectivity, extroversion, and visible social engagement, the act of retreating into isolation is frequently misinterpreted as a sign of depression, social anxiety, or bitter withdrawal from society. However, when viewed through the framework of high emotional intelligence and sensory processing, solitude functions not as a pathology, but as an essential, high-level calibration strategy. An individual with deep emotional attunement operates with highly permeable, energetic, and psychological boundaries. Throughout the course of a typical day, as they interact with family members, colleagues, acquaintances, or even strangers in public spaces, their nervous system acts like an open sponge, continuously absorbing the unexpressed anxieties, latent grief, ambient stress, and chaotic emotional states of the people around them. Because an empath's mirror neuron system is exceptionally active, these external emotional inputs are not merely observed from a distance, they are experienced physiologically within their own body. Without deliberate intervention, the boundary between where the empath's authentic self ends and where another person's emotional energy begins becomes increasingly blurred. Over time, this cumulative emotional buildup creates a state of internal congestion, leading to cognitive fatigue, emotional saturation, and a loss of personal clarity. Solitude is the primary mechanism through which this accumulated external noise is systematically flushed out. It is the controlled environment where the emotional frequency of the outside world is muted, allowing the individual's baseline nervous system to downregulate and return to its natural equilibrium. When an emotionally powerful person isolates themselves, they are executing a crucial process of emotional hygiene. In the silence of their own space, away from the gaze and unspoken demands of others, they are finally able to audit their internal state. They ask themselves the subconscious question: which of these feelings belong to me and which belong to the world? Solitude allows them to process the lingering impressions left by the people they encountered, sort through the data collected by their hyperactive perceptual radar, and release the tension that does not belong to them. This period of isolation is fundamentally restorative. It restores the clarity of their intuitive faculties, sharpens their cognitive focus, and allows them to reconnect with their core identity, values, and purpose. Far from being a sign of weak social skills or a surrender to loneliness, this intentional retreat is a demonstration of profound self-awareness and emotional discipline. An empath who does not master the art of strategic solitude will inevitably succumb to severe empathy fatigue, resentment, and chronic burnout, rendering their gift of emotional depth a permanent liability. By prioritizing extended periods of quiet self-reflection, they actively protect their psychological integrity. They ensure that when they do choose to step back into the social realm, they do so with sharp perception, grounded strength, and complete sovereignty over their own internal state, rather than coming from a position of depletion and reactive emotional oversaturation. The ultimate transformation for a highly sensitive individual occurs when they shift their perspective from viewing emotional depth as a fragile vulnerability to recognizing it as an advanced psychological capability. In the early stages of developing emotional intelligence, raw empathy often feels like an unpredictable burden, an open door through which the chaotic energies, unexpressed anxieties, and heavy burdens of the external world enter unchecked. Without a clear framework for emotional regulation, an individual can easily become overwhelmed, mistaking the absorbed distress of others for their own internal reality. However, true mastery of emotional depth begins when one realizes that sensitivity without structure is self-destruction, whereas sensitivity coupled with firm, non-negotiable boundaries is the absolute foundation of strategic insight and authentic personal power. The transition from feeling burdened to achieving emotional mastery depends on a conscious pivot from passive absorption to active regulation. Highly effective empaths learn to differentiate between two distinct modes of operation: emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. While emotional empathy involves physically feeling another person's state, cognitive empathy allows an individual to deeply understand, analyze, and anticipate another person's emotional perspective without absorbing the accompanying physiological stress. By mastering this distinction, the emotionally intelligent individual transforms their internal radar from an open sponge into a controlled lens. They gain the ability to step into a room, read the underlying power dynamics, identify unseen tensions, and understand the core motivations of those around them with surgical precision, all while keeping their own internal nervous system perfectly calm and detached. Central to this mastery is the implementation of uncompromising boundaries. An individual who has stepped into their true emotional strength understands that holding space for others does not require sacrificing their own stability. They recognize that saying no to superficial demands, stepping away from toxic or performative dynamics, and protecting their personal time are not acts of selfishness, but vital practices of emotional conservation. These boundaries act as a protective filter, ensuring that access to their deep presence and intuitive wisdom is reserved exclusively for situations and relationships that are grounded in mutual respect and total authenticity. Rather than seeking validation through broad social acceptance or a vast network of acquaintances, they channel their perceptual gifts inward to build unshakable self-awareness, emotional resilience, and mental clarity. When emotional depth is governed by strict boundary control, it ceases to be a liability and becomes an extraordinary asset in leadership, decision-making, and high-stakes interpersonal dynamics. Powerful empaths who have mastered their sensitivity possess an extraordinary capacity to navigate complex human situations that leave others baffled. They see through deceptive social posturing, predict behavioral patterns before they manifest, and build deep, unwavering trust with the small handful of individuals allowed into their inner sphere. They do not fear the isolation that often accompanies high perception. Instead, they embrace it as the forge in which their clarity is maintained. By taking complete ownership of their perceptual gifts, they move through the world not as passive victims of their environment, but as grounded, formidable architects of their own emotional sovereignty.